Hello, MD Consult family. Today we are going to have another webinar, and today we're going to focus on specifically on a framework which is known as the MoSCoW framework. So many of you guys have been requesting about how do we create prioritizations when we have customer requirements, how do we align them to values, and so on and so forth. So today's intention of this webinar is basically to share with you a framework which is known as the MoSCoW framework. And it helps us align the customer requirements to the value. And today we're going to talk about four things primarily. A, what exactly is the MoSCoW framework? The second one is that, of course, if there's a framework, there have to be prerequisites for it. So what are the prerequisites before we can even apply the MoSCoW framework? And then we come to the meat of the matter is that how do you actually determine the priority? And then the last one is that we're going to align it and assign it to a scenario, and we're going to see how exactly works out. All right. So if you have any questions, just raise your hand or send us a chat later, and then we can go ahead and take those questions as they come in. All right, let's get started. All right, so first things first, what exactly is the MoSCoW framework? The name is actually kind of indicative of what exactly it is about. It has four things in it. What are the must-have requirements? What are the should-have requirements? What are the could-have requirements? And the last one is won't have at all. And the intent of this framework is basically, based on these four alignment criteria that we have, is that apply this framework to help us prioritize what the requirements are. So that's kind of what the term stands for, and it's kind of also listed here just in case if you were paying attention to the slides. So it's not a new framework; it has been around. A software development expert by the name of Dai Clegg, and I hope I'm stating the name correctly, kind of created the framework when he was working at Oracle. And this is the technique he kind of used, and then it became very popularized. And of course, there are other prioritizing frameworks we're going to talk about in the future. The ICE framework, the RICE framework, the RICE-O, which we came up with at MD Consult. So we're going to talk about those in the futures as well. But the key takeaway from this slide basically is it helps you identify what are those critical factors that the customers are looking for, and then how do we achieve them. And those are the ones that you can classify as must-haves. And should-haves, while it's the second one, it's not that far off from the must-haves. It's just that the return on investment, the value that is being created by the should-haves is minutely lower than the must-haves. And the return on investment and the time to market aligning with the customers is all pretty much very much aligned with the must-haves. All right, so that's what, in a very concise manner, what the MoSCoW framework stands for. And let's talk about prerequisites. Then again, the first question that may pop in your head is that, okay, great that I have this framework, but how exactly, do I work with it? My project is not just my own. I have a lot of stakeholders. So that's where we start from in this specific framework, is that the first thing that everybody needs to do from a product and a project perspective is understand and identify who all these stakeholders are. And then there's an alignment that is achieved based on what the objectives and the prioritization factors would be. And again, like I said, what the factors are that influence the MoSCoW framework, we actually use a leverage another framework, which we can talk about that later in subsequent webinars. The second most important things that needs to happen is that, anytime somebody wants to prioritize, somebody else is going to have a different criteria for prioritization, or they will not agree. So in terms of disagreements, as and when they arise, there should be a tiebreaker, a person who's actually suggesting and saying, okay, I'm going to make the final call. Or within the team, there could be a voting criteria. So it's actually very clear that if there's a disagreement on prioritization, who makes the final call on it. And the last thing is that as prioritization happens and tasks are defined, it is also as important to figure out what are the resources you're going to allocate to each one of these. So you're not going to have an infinite pool of resources who can actually drive these. So the intent would be is to take the understanding of what the requirement is, align it with the customer, understanding what they're looking for from a value-driven perspective, and then internally figure out the value of the stakeholders and how many resources or a resource mix that should be assigned to that specific task that is being prioritized. All right, good. Any questions so far? All right, I see a question in the chat here is that could these resources be onshore, offshore, mixed? Well, it all depends where the expertise lies, right? So you don't have to have the first set of resources just simply aligned or assigned right out of the gate. You have to understand what the requirement is. If it's a technical requirement, then of course you need to figure out where the right resource mix is. If you have onshore, right short set of resources, then you can figure out what is the best resource to allocate to this project. And the best part is, since this is value driven, there will never be a contention on I'm working on a high value project or I'm working on a low value project. Because these customer requirements that are coming in have an outcome and a value already aligned with the customer's expectations. So it's not the reverse of aligning something with the customer request, but rather now progressing post understanding what the customer's value is that needs to be driven. But good question. All right, another question in the chat is that who exactly makes the decision when it comes to disagreements? Well, like I said, it depends on the organizational structure. If you have a matrix organization, depending on where the project is coming in, that organization could make the decision. But when it comes to the project itself and the person who is driving it, who has the best understanding of what the customer's requirements are, what they're looking for from an immediate point of view, is the one who should actually be making the decision. So, I mean, there are certain things that are also coming from an agile framework, if you're familiar with that. There's the concept of Scrum Master, and then there's a concept of the product owner. The product owner basically ends up deciding at the end of the day from a disagreement point of view on how to make a decision. And the Scrum Master basically is the person who helps mitigate, right? So you can, maybe if you look at that agile framework that is coming in, it also helps define from a stakeholder point of view who could be the decision maker. All right, good question. All right, let's move to the next one. All right, so this is the one where I want to spend maybe a few minutes on, right? How do exactly determine the priority? This is maybe one of the shortcomings of the MoSCoW framework. It doesn't give clear criteria on how exactly should a ranking be done. But as I previously suggested, there are multiple different frameworks that are out there that can be used to rank different types of values that are coming in. First of all, you have to take the customer into consideration. So what we have actually done is that we have given you a set of 5 ranking methodologies that could be used to determine the priority. So they vary from weighted scoring, value versus complexity, Kano model, buy a feature, opportunity scoring. The ones that we have not listed here is basically what is also referred to as a RICE model or an ICE model, or the ones that we have actually created and we leverage in almost all the projects that we have that we work for their customers. It is known as the RICE-O model. And in subsequent release, or webinars, we're going to show you how to use and implement a RICE model. So maybe look for another webinar that we're going to do post this one. But just to give you an idea, a weighted scoring is basically you list down all the requirements that you have, and like the word suggests, you give each one of them a weight. The higher the weight, the more important it is, and i.e. it is implemented or part of the must-haves. And then it could also help you identify, because it is stack ranked now based on the weight, on what's going to go in the must-have, the should-have, the could-have, and basically something that we can look at it from a future perspective. The second one, which is value versus complexity, again, the question may come in is that, okay, just because is it complex, is it not valuable? The inverse could be applicable as well. So what we try to do, like I said, is that we at MD Consult don't try to get into the weighted scoring and trying to figure out what the value versus the complexity is, or the Kano model. Buy a feature, I mean, again, how much are you going to, customer is willing to pay for it? And opportunity scoring, it's very similar to the weighted scoring, but it doesn't have the weight. It's just that opportunity is the highest, lowest, medium, so on and so forth. So like I said, in the future webinars we're going to do, we're end up going to share with you but we will share with you the other models that you can utilize. All right, let me take a pause here and see if there are any questions. Why would you use the MoSCoW prioritization? Well, the good part is that right off the bat, if you're starting a project, in many cases, you have no idea which boxes or how to prioritize to begin with, right? So what the MoSCoW framework does is at its most core level, it allows you to distribute the requirements into different buckets, if I can call them that. There's no weightage to it. There's no, I shouldn't say that there's no rhyme or reason, but it's actually more value driven from a customer perspective, right? Because these are customer requirements that are coming in. So internally, it gives you a very quick and fast and dirty way, if I can call it that, to start putting these items into different buckets. And then once you double click on it, you can actually use a different ranking methodology to figure out, okay, is my prioritization correct or not? So the intent is not that the should have could not move into the could haves and the could haves not move into the must haves, but they are outcome driven, and that's exactly what we are looking for, is an outcome driven, especially from a customer perspective, right? They don't care how we rank them. They are more worried about or trying to understand is that how are they receiving the value for what they are paying for. And what the MoSCoW framework does is basically allows you to categorize each of these requirements into different priorities. Think of it as a back of a napkin kind of thing. And what we will do is that in the next slide that is coming up, I will actually share with you a very high level scenario on how things could have, how things are actually applied leveraging this framework based on a scenario that we have created. All right, so let's maybe move on to that. It's a good transition point. So here's the MoSCoW framework actually applied to a scenario. So the first things before you start reading into the boxes, the intent of this is to give you a very high level, right? So when a requirement, like example, that comes in from a customer to even MD Konsulting says, hey, how do I take this feature out? We actually ask a simple question: Are you developing a feature? Are you developing a product? Or are you developing a business? We'll talk about that maybe in a future webinar as well. But if I bring that back here, if you look at the top, it's the highest value is on the far left, and the lowest value is on the bottom right quadrant. So that's what the MoSCoW framework allows you to do, is quickly analyze the customer requirements and figure out what are the must-haves, should-haves, could-haves, and the won't-haves. So if you're thinking, what is the must-have? It's the top left quadrant, and on the top right is the should-haves. On the bottom left are the could-haves, and on the bottom right are the won't-haves. It's also sometimes known as a wish list. So let's say we have a scenario where somebody says prioritize feature for a new software release. And the question would come is that, how do I prioritize the feature? I don't even know. So the first thing is that you have to look at, from a value-driven perspective, is it a high value and does it align with customer needs? And so, for example, and again, this is just a scenario, right? You could plug in any different types of boxes here or requirements here. So, for example, in the must-haves, we suggested compatibility with the latest operating systems. So if I'm creating a feature that is not compatible with the latest operating system, it's going to take us a lot of amount of work to make it N-1 or N-2 if we have that kind of operating systems out in the market. And then second one right now, which is very important these days, is that the security features to protect our user data. So both of these are kind of like a must-haves. Then the should-haves could be is that if I have a third-party software that is being used, I need to be able to make sure that it has integration with other commonly used software, and it has improved performance and speed. Well, the reason why, if you're thinking why the second one or why some things could be in the must-haves and the should-haves, think of it this way. Performance may not be an issue, but we want to improve upon it. So it should be a should have. With the new release that is coming out or the new feature, it should not impact the performance and the speed if it's already good enough. Otherwise, improve for performance and speed should actually be in the must have, and compatibility with the latest operating system could actually move to the right. Or the improved performance and speed would be the three vectors that are going to be in the top left quadrant, and your should have could may only be one. A could have is that, let's create a new user interface, but does it create any value? Well, if the customer hasn't necessarily complained about a user interface, do you really have to worry about it? We can use it for future releases, make it a little bit more dynamic in nature, but it's a could have. It's not something the customer is looking for. So the way to think about it is that on the top are the high value driven customer requirements aligned with customer needs, and the bottom quadrants are the low value and customer needs requirements. Now, if we switch quickly to the won't have, we want to support the less commonly used languages. Use English as the first one. Now we would like to introduce another language in it, but we don't have as many users in that language. So is it worth the time and the effort? Maybe not in this release. We can probably do it in the future releases, and there could be some niche functionalities that could be added to this one. All right, let me take a pause there and see if you have any questions. All right, so the question in the chat is that are won't haves some things that we will never implement? Well, that's a good question. I mean, again, the won't haves doesn't necessarily mean we won't have them. It just means that for the iteration that for this specific feature that we're developing, it's probably not something that we want to implement right off the time, right? Because remember, if I go back to the first item that we had talked about, you also have to assign resources to this. So if you have a resource that is more valued, aligned with the value on the must-haves and the should-haves, the won't-haves or the wish kind of move to the second phase or the future phases. So it could be a roadmap item. Think of it that way. So the won't-haves and the could-haves, won't-have just necessarily means I'm putting a boundary for this specific software release. These are the things we will not include as part of this because we don't necessarily see the value that is being created for this. But the other ones we will actually apply because we do see a value created to this one. So in many cases, once the first initial setup is done, and the prioritization criteria, which, like I said, we will discuss in the future webinars, like the RICE and the ICE and the RICE-O model or other models like the Kano model, the weighted average, whatever you're going to use. Right after that, when you double click on it, you could actually come back and say, you know what, I see higher value coming in from an X feature that or an X priority that we have listed in the should have. Can we move it to the must have? But again, the intent is not to dwell on creating prioritize that instead of figuring out how do we start working on it, we're still quabbling about what exactly is it that we're going to be doing. That's what the intent is. We need to stop the indecisiveness or the indecisions that are not leading anywhere, but rather make quick decisions. And this is the framework that helps us quickly, like I said, bucketize things into the criteria that we want to talk about and we want to implement, which are also aligned with the customer needs. All right, so we are about 2 minutes into this webinar. I wanted to have it no more than about 15 to 18 minutes. Think of it as a quick bite, so we're about at 17 minutes. Are there any other questions from anyone? Feel free to type them in chat. Would there be medium values and customer needs? Absolutely. So again, the high box or the high, if you think about it as a 4 quadrant, right? You could have the high here. You could have the high medium here. You can have medium here, and then medium low. Again, I'm just making stuff up if you want to think of it this way. So the most highest things, the most value driven are the ones in the top left quadrant. Followed right after that are the should haves. Behind there are the could haves, and the last one are the won't haves. So yes, I mean, if you think about it from a high, medium, low perspective, you can apply a methodology there. Like I said, these could be the high, this could be the high, medium, so on and so forth. But yeah, good question. Again, I think from an implementation point of view, think of it right off the bat. If you do have customer requirements and you need to figure out how do you prioritize them, this is an exercise that you can do within a few hours with your entire team. It's not hard to understand how the criteria behind this is. And then the second steps could be actually using the RICE framework or the ICE-O framework or the RICE-O framework to then prioritize and then actually say, okay, this is what fits here, and that's how we're going to do it. All right, so we're almost at time. Again, you can reach out to us through any of these avenues, social media channels. So we did take agreement from everybody else in the beginning that we will be posting this on our YouTube channel coming up very shortly. So give us maybe a day or so, and you should see this up and running. Do leave the comments there, like and subscribe to the channel. Other than that, you can follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and our website is listed at the bottom. All right, thanks everybody. Great session. See you guys in the next session soon. All right, have a good one. Bye.